We'll wait one more minute or so and then we'll start. All right, let's start. I'm putting the link to the sources in the chat, as I always do. If you are listening to this or watching this at some later date and you want the sources, please email me, deborahklapper@gmail.com. Okay, I'm also going to share my screen so we can all look at it together. There we go. Okay. So we are skipping what would probably have amounted to 2 or 3 classes worth of material at this point, because I do want to get to Pesach before Pesach. And maybe we'll come back to the stuff we skipped, maybe we won't. It's mostly material about the mystical dangers of everything from leaning on palm trees to doing things in even numbers to going outside at night on the wrong day of the week. And I don't actually understand most of it. I'm not sure anyone does. So we'll see. Maybe we'll come back to it, maybe we won't. In the meantime, tonight's topic is the Seder plate and the beginning of the Seder. And we are skipping straight to the next Mishnah, which is at the top or middle of 114a. Okay, so the Mishnah begins, Mazgulu kos rishon. They mixed, or they poured for him the first cup. Remember that because we're diluting our cups of wine with water, mixing the cup and pouring the cup are functionally the same verb. Beit Shammai omrim mevarech al hayom ve'achar kach mevarech al hayayin. Beit Shammai say that first you make the bracha on the day. That's the bracha we think would call kiddush, and then you make the bracha on the wine. That's the Borei Pri Hagafen. And Beit Hillel says mevarech al hayayin ve'achar kach mevarech al hayom. The other way around, which is the way we do it. We say Borei Pri Hagafen, and then we say the bracha of kiddush, which in this particular case would be the one for Yom Tov, but the truth is that for all kiddushes, we do it in this order. And the Gemara is going to tell us what Beit Shammai's reasoning for this. So let's let them do that. Okay. Tana Rabbanan. Devarim shebein Beit Shammai uVeit Hillel b'Seuda. We have a Braita that claims it's going to tell us the things that Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel disagree about at a meal. I assume that we are only here being given part of the Braita, because the Mishnah in Brachot gives a long list of things that Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai disagree about at meals, and this is only one of them. So I assume that this was at some point a much longer Braita that explained all of the items on that list. But what we have is just part of that. Okay, so Beit Shammai omrim mevarech al hayom ve'achar kach mevarech al hayayin. Beit Shammai say, as we said in the Mishnah, that first you say kiddush and then you say the bracha on the wine. Mipnei she'hayom gorim li'ayin lavo, because the day is what's causing the wine to be there. Kfar kidesh hayom v'adayin yayin lo ba, and the day already became holy and the wine's not there yet. Okay, so as far as Beit Shammai is concerned, it's all about order, and in logical order, the day is causing us to need the wine, so the day was there first. So you talk about the day first, and then you talk about the wine. And in actual chronological order, it's been Shabbat or Yom Tov for an hour or so already, and you haven't drunk the wine yet. So the day also precedes the wine in chronological order. Okay, so we have 2 reasons for Beit Shammai why you would bless on the day first. Ubeit Hillel omrim mevarech al hayayin v'achar kach mevarech al hayom mipnei shehayayin gorim l'kiddushet te'amar. Beit Hillel says We say it the other way around. We bless on the wine first and then on the day, because the wine is what makes it possible to say the Kiddush. It's true, we're making Kiddush because of the day, but you can't do it without the wine. So there may be something a little bit circular about both of these reasonings. Davar acher, Beit Hillel has another reason as well. Birkat hayayin tadira, uberkat hayom eina tadira, tadir v'sheino tadir kodem. The blessing on wine is something that happens frequently, at least more frequently than we have holidays. And the blessing on the day happens relatively infrequently because it only happens at night on Yom Tov. So that's only a dozen or so days of the year. And when you have something common and something uncommon, you do the something common first. And an example of this, this principle operates in many things that we do in Judaism, but a relatively straightforward example is the normative layout of the Siddur, in which you have all of the weekday stuff at the front, followed by all of the Shabbat stuff, followed by all the holiday stuff. This is true also of the ordering of various different kinds of tefillot and of priority structures for any number of different kinds of things. It's a pretty common principle. In any case, the Hilchata Kedivrei Beit Hillel, and the law follows Beit Hillel. The first thing the Gemara wants to know about this Braita is my davar acher. Why did Beit Hillel, after giving us the reason that the wine is what's making the Kiddush possible, why did Beit Hillel say, oh, and I have another reason why we should make Kiddush in this order? So the reason is that otherwise you might have said, if Beit Hillel had given one reason, even if it's a compelling reason, that since Beit Shammai had given two reasons, if Beit Hillel gives only one reason, then you might say, well, these guys have two reasons, those guys only have one reason, two beats one, so I guess Beit Shammai wins. So in case you would say that, Beit Hillel has defended itself by giving a second reason, which is tadir v'sheino tadir kodem, with the result that v'halacha k'divrei Beit Hillel. The common comes before the uncommon, and the law follows Beit Hillel. That seems to be a quote, which is just reminding us of what the end of the Braita said. Now that it's explained why it's there. Okay, but now we're more interested in that last bit. Right, the Braita told us that the law follows Beit Hillel, but as you might be aware, the law almost always follows Beit Hillel. This shouldn't be a particular surprise. And that's what the Gemara says. Shita. It says that's obvious. Daha lo nafik batel. Because there was a heavenly voice that came out. You don't need to tell me that the law is like Beit Hillel in this place. The heavenly voice said the law is always like Beit Hillel. Ibaidema. So it might be that this is kodem batel, that the Braita was written before the heavenly voice told us that the law follows Beit Hillel, in which case perhaps the law was already like Beit Hillel before God said so, and at that point you would have needed to record it, maybe. Or v'ibaidema la'achar batel, or maybe it was even after the heavenly voice, the Rabbi Yehoshua, but it's following the position of Rabbi Yehoshua, the Amar in mashgichin bevatel, and Rabbi Yehoshua said that we don't follow a batel. So, meaning that we don't change the rules of jurisprudence just because a heavenly voice comes down. We take a vote among the actual human authorities, and we use whatever our normal rules would be for deciding what the rules are. And actually, only humans get a vote. Heavenly voices don't get votes. They certainly don't get vetoes. Is the position of Rabbi Yehoshua, which we saw that position maybe 14 or 15 classes ago when we talked about the Oven of Achnai. Okay, that is the end of Kiddush, and there's very little Gemara on that Mishnah about Kiddush, mostly because the Gemara that belongs on that Mishnah, we already learned for like 3 weeks in a row before we got to the Mishnah, because the structure is the way it is. The Gemara is not organized to put everything that's on one topic exactly where you would expect to find it. It has other organizational principles. Okay, next mission. Heviu lifanav. They served him. Doesn't say what they served him, but they served him something. Mitabel b'chazeret ad shemagia leparperet hapat. He dips lettuce until he gets to the parperet hapat, which there's a somewhat disputed term as to what it means. We're going to translate it as appetizer for right now. And it certainly can mean appetizer. And here it seems to be referring to the eating of the maror. So let's go with that. Yeah.
So is chazeret always translated as lettuce?
As far as I know, chazeret always means lettuce. Yes. Why?
I was just curious because, as I recall, there was some debate about this on Jewish Sharon last year.
Huh. Well, let's see what Jastra
Somebody was talking about onions.
Interesting. Let's see what Jastra says. Not that someone certainly could disagree with Jastrow, and he's been dead for more than 100 years. I'm sure people have disagreed with him about many things, but he's relatively authoritative. He does only define it as lettuce. He offers the possibility of garden lettuce versus wild lettuce, but he says it's lettuce. But anytime you're dealing with a species, it's very, very difficult to know exactly what you're talking about unless you have a drawing or a seed or something, because among other things, species change over time. There's no guarantee that they had exactly the same vegetables that we have. They almost certainly didn't, in fact. And if you had to communicate with a man from Mars and explain to them what species of vegetables you ate in your dinner tonight, would you be able to do that in words that didn't use any names of vegetables? Like I said, I can totally believe that we could get the identity of a species of vegetable wrong. I just don't happen to have heard that, but it could be. In any case, it is the same vegetable that they're using for maror. That I think is indisputable because it uses the same word both places. And in fact, the entire content of the next chunk of our Gemara is going to be devoted to the fact that we're eating the same vegetable twice. In any case, it sounds like you're kind of like nibbling on a tray of lettuce and a dip as you go through the Seder until you get to eating the maror. It does not sound like you're eating like a sprig of parsley and then doing magid for 3 hours before you eat anything else, which nonetheless tends to be the way we actually do Seders, but that's not what the wording sounds like here in the Mishnah to me. Okay. The next, they bring in front of him matzah and more lettuce and charoset and 2 cooked foods. Even though charoset is not a mitzvah, it should be brought at this point anyway. Now, this sounds like a description of what we would call a Seder plate. It's not exactly the same list of foods, but it's pretty close. And it sounds like it was not on the table. Actually, a couple of things. It sounds like it was not on the table when the Seder started, is the first thing. The second thing is it sounds like the food that was on the Seder plate is the food that people are actually eating. It doesn't sound like a little bit of something on a plate nobody eats off of that's just symbolic, and then you put it away in the refrigerator and bring it out again the next night for the second Seder. Although they might have had that too, but if so, it's not mentioned here. Okay. Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Tzadok Amar Omer mitzvah. Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Tzadok says it is a mitzvah. Uvamikdash hayu mivi'in lefanav gufo shel Pesach. And in the mikdash, although presumably that means in the time of the temple, because nobody's actually eating in the mikdash, they would bring in front of him the body of the Korban Pesach, which is not actually going to be eaten until the end of Shulchan Aruch, so it sounds like it just sort of sits there on the table while you're eating. Okay. And for that matter, while you're having the rest of the Seder. Gemara. Amar Reish Lakish, Zot omeret mitzvot tzrichot kavana. So Reish Lakish says, I'm inferring from this Mishnah that mitzvot require intention. That is to say, that if you do the action that's required by the mitzvah, but you didn't mean to do the mitzvah, or possibly it means if you meant not to do the mitzvah, which is not exactly the same thing, then that does not fulfill the mitzvah. You need a combination of the action and the intent for the action to count. And he's getting this from Kevan delo be'idan chiyuva demarar hu da'achile beborei pri ha'adama hu da'achile. He says, because when you ate your first chazeret, that was not at the time of eating maror, and so you ate it with just a borei pri ha'adama. You just said the bracha of borei pri ha'adama. You did not say asher kitchanu b'mitzvotav v'tzifanu al achilat maror, and you ate it. And now it even sounds to the Mishnah like you're sort of nibbling on chazeret all the way through until you get to the maror, and now all of a sudden you're going to take your next bite of the same vegetable you've been nibbling on for 2 hours, and now you're making it a bracha on the mitzvah of eating it. So Reish Lakish says that sounds to me like either, and I don't know that you can tell from what he says which he means, but either you don't fulfill the mitzvah of maror until you say, okay, now I'm doing maror, and so you haven't done it yet because you didn't say that yet, or at least it's possible to say, I am not doing the mitzvah of maror now, and then you won't be doing it until you change your mind and say, okay, now I'm doing the mitzvah of maror. I'm sort of inclined toward the first version of what I said, but I'm not sure you can totally be sure based on Reish Lakish's work. Okay. Vidilma lo ikaven lamaror, hilkach bai lehader litbula l'shem maror. Maybe he it must be that he didn't intend to do the mitzvah of maror, and that's why he needs to go back and dip again for the purpose of maror. Notice also that it doesn't sound like he's dipping in something different, which I'll come back to in a second. The isa gadatach mitzvah lo by kavana lama lach trei tibule. Because if you thought that mitzvot don't require intention, why would he have to dip and presumably eat twice, since he already did the mitzvah? If all it takes to have done the mitzvah of maror is for it to be the first night of Pesach and for you to put lettuce in your mouth and chew and swallow, he did that already. If it doesn't require saying it's maror or thinking that it's maror or making the bracha of maror, then it's done already, so you can't do it again. In terms of whether there's two different dips here, it's hard to say. On the one hand, it doesn't say anything about bringing a different dip. And on the other hand, in the Mishnah, they don't bring out the charoset until after karpas. So it does sound like there is a different dip on the table, but it does not say what it is, and it does not sound like it matters what it is. Okay. So sorry, the next bit is the end of the previous sentence. He already dipped it and ate it. That's the end of the previous sentence, which was that he shouldn't need to dip twice. Okay. Mimai. So why? Maybe in fact you don't need intention to do a mitzvah. And you asked me why you need to dip twice. That might be so that the children notice. And in fact, this is supported, although the Gemara does not note this, by the fact that in our version of the Manishtana, the children ask, or the parents ask the children. We'll get to that, I hope, next week. Whether it's the one or the other, about the fact that there are two dippings instead of one. So it's plausible that that this is just another instance of acting peculiar, so that the children notice and say something about it. And once you introduce that factor, it's very difficult to prove anything about halachic structure in general from the way we do things at the Seder, because about almost anything you could say, oh, well, yeah, that's not normal. That's just what we do at the Seder, so that the children will say, but that's not normal. So once you announce that everything we're doing is strange, it becomes very difficult to draw conclusions about normal life from anything that we're doing. Okay. So, but in that case, v'chitema im kain lishmainan shar yirakot. So you might say, if we're just dipping twice in order for the children to say, "Mommy, why are you dipping twice?" then why didn't we at least use a different vegetable, and then we won't have a legal problem that you might have already eaten your maror, which in fact, as I understand it, is the standard practice, is to use a different vegetable for maror and for karpas for exactly that reason. But the Mishnah did not make that choice. If the Mishnah had, in its narrative, described using a different vegetable, then Hava Amina, then I would have thought that, well, you only dip twice if you have two different vegetables, but if you only have one vegetable, don't dip twice. So the Mishnah chose the more interesting case, the case where you would have thought that you shouldn't dip twice and make a second bracha and eat again, and said that you do all those things anyway. And that's a pretty consistent thing that we've seen the Mishnah do, and or the Gemara say that the Mishnah does, which is to say that choose the case that most exemplifies whatever it is, whatever the point is it's trying to make, rather than a normal case or a case that makes life easy, or even a case that's plausible sometimes. Instead, it chooses the case that teaches us the most about whatever it is it's trying to teach us about. Okay, I'm sorry. And again, I cut myself off in the middle of the sentence. This is the end of that sentence. But you might think, if it had only taught one, if it had taught about two different kinds of vegetables, you might think that if you only have lettuce, that you don't dip twice. So we've learned from this that even if you only have lettuce, you need two dippings. And in that case, you would do it so that it's interesting for the children, so the children recognize it, so the children will ask about it. Which leaves us in the end with no conclusion about the question of whether mitzvot require intention or not, which is discussed in a number of other places in the Gemara, and which remains an open matter for debate for quite some time after the close of the Gemara. And the only answer that one could give as to whether mitzvot require intention now is it's complicated, or sort of, or maybe, or something like that. Because in fact, it's not really been resolved. And to the extent it's been resolved, it's been by saying different things in different cases. Okay. Now we quote another Breita. V'od Tanya, achlan demai yatsa. So we're going to give some examples of ways that you might eat maror, where you might think that you wouldn't have fulfilled the mitzvah, but in fact you have. And the first one is if you ate your maror as demai. Now, in order to explain what demai is, we need to back up a little bit. When you farm your grain and vegetable and fruit crops in the land of Israel, you have certain gifts, or they're actually more like taxes, but we call them gifts, that need to be given before the food is kosher, once the processing is finished. So once you've collected everything and processed it to the point that it's going to be able to be stored. The grain has been threshed and winnowed and whatever, and the fruits and vegetables have been tied into bundles and whatever it is that you do with these things before you put them away or sell them. Then you take off truma, which does not have a specific amount, but the Mishnah says it should be between a 60th and a 40th of your crop. That goes to Kohanim, and it is a very serious sin for someone who's not a Kohen or a member of a Kohen family to eat truma. And apparently in the time of the Mishnah, even the Amei Haaretz, who are not especially cooperative with the rabbi's instructions, even the Amei Haaretz are afraid to eat truma, and they do take off the truma and give it to a Kohen. The next step, which from here on in our steps, the Amei Haaretz are suspected of not necessarily following instructions. It's unclear exactly what percentage of the time they do or don't follow instructions, but we don't trust them. But the rest of the procedure is as follows. You take a 10th of your crop, and that goes to a Levi. That's called Maaser. The Levi then takes a 10th of what you gave him and gives that to a Kohen. That is what the Torah calls Maaser min ha-Maaser, a 10th of a 10th, or what the Mishnah calls Trumat Maaser, the Truma from the Maaser. Either way, it goes to a Kohen, has the same rules as all of the other kinds of Truma. Then you go back to your crop and remove another 10th, which is now a 9% of what you started with, because it's a 10th of 90%. And that is, depending on the year of the Shemitah cycle, either going to go to the poor, or it is going to be yours, but you have to eat it in your shalai. And it's then called either Maaser Ani or Maaser Shein. Okay, and until you get to that stage in the process, you're not allowed to eat the rest of the food. Now, if you buy produce from an Am Haaretz and he says, yep, I absolutely took all the gifts, it's all set, it's totally kosher, go ahead and eat it, you can assume that he took the first truma, but you have to assume that he's lying about the rest of it, and you have to take it again. And the food, while it's in that state, while you're not trusting him and don't know whether it's been properly fixed, is called demai. Demai is kosher to be eaten by the very poor, even without fixing it, and under certain other circumstances when there are no other options. But for the most part, we treat it as not quite kosher. So it occupies a sort of a middle space. Okay, so coming back to our Breita. If you ate maror that was demai, yatsa, you did fulfill the mitzvah of maror, even though you were not supposed to eat this stuff, but we might even say it's probably kosher. Just the rabbis told you to assume that it's not, but probably it is. So that's good enough that you did the mitzvah, even though you also did something wrong. Achlan below mitkavein yatsa. If you ate it without intending to eat it, which somehow that line didn't make it into the translation. I'm really sorry. I guess I was typing too quickly. Okay, I'll try to fix it for the future. If you ate it without intending, you fulfilled your mitzvah. And if you ate it in halves, you fulfilled your mitzvah. So if you ate, suppose you have only exactly enough maror to do the mitzvah, which would be a kazayid, an olive size, which on a historical level, almost certainly the Gemara actually meant the size of an actual normal olive. I strongly recommend, if anyone's interested, the article that Rabbi Slifkin wrote about the historical development of the olive size and the other sizes that depend on it in the Ashkenazi rabbinate. If you Google Rabbi Slifkin olive, I think you'll find it. It's in English and relatively easy to read and very interesting. In any case, let's assume we're talking about an olive size. So you have a piece of lettuce the size of an olive. That's all you've got. If you ate half of it for karpas and the other half for maror, so you ate it in halves, yatsa, you still fulfilled the mitzvah. And we're going to modify that in the Gemara, so don't jump to conclusions yet. Ubilvad shelo yisheh ben. Oh, sorry, we modify it right here. Ubilvad shelo yisheh ben achila lechaverta yoter mikdei achila pras. As long as you didn't wait in between one eating and the other eating more than a kidei achilat pras, the amount of time that it takes to eat a pras. A pras is half of a pita or half of a loaf of bread. Without knowing exactly how quickly you eat your loaf of bread or how large the pita was to begin with, that's a somewhat baffling instruction. I believe a kidei achila pras is generally considered to be something on the order of 8 or 9 minutes, but don't trust me. You should look that up if it matters halachically, because I'm working off the top of my head here. I did not look it up. In any case, that would be a pretty fast magi. if you manage to eat your karpas and then your maror in a kidei achila pras, but supposing you manage to do that, you could still count the whole thing for your maror, even though you ate half of an olive here and half of an olive 6 minutes later or whatever. Okay. So that sounds like it's very explicitly saying that, first of all, that you can use the karpas as maror, and second of all, that you don't need to intend for it to be maror or for it to count as maror. It says you ate it, you didn't intend, you did the mitzvah anyway. It says it right there. But that doesn't resolve the issue, because the Gemara says Tanai, but it's a dispute between Tanaim. Titania, Rabbi Yosei Omer, Afo Pisha Tibel bechazeret, mitzvah lahavi lefanav chazeret becharoset b'shnei tavshil. Rabbi Yosei says even if he dipped lettuce, presumably as karpas here, it's a mitzvah to bring him more lettuce and charoset and 2 cooked foods. That sounds like the fact that he already dipped and ate his lettuce did not count. It's saying it's a mitzvah to bring him more lettuce. Sounds like he needs more lettuce. Okay, v'akati mimai. Nonetheless, like, do we really need to say that Rabbi Yosei requires intent? Dilma kasava Rabbi Yosei mitzvot ein tzrichot kavana. Maybe Rabbi Yosei really thinks that mitzvot don't require intent, but the high debainan tre tibule, and this thing that they require 2 dippings, kihechi de tehave hekera latinokot. Maybe that's just because you have to dip twice so that the children notice. So, okay, you already ate your lettuce, and so you already did the mitzvah of maror, so you don't really need to dip it, but the children need to see you dip twice, so somebody better bring you more lettuce so you can dip again. Maybe that's all Rabbi Yosei meant. But the Gemara says, nah, imkain my mitzvah. In that case, you wouldn't use language of it's a mitzvah to bring him more lettuce. So you might say he ought to dip more lettuce, somebody should bring him more lettuce, but it's a mitzvah to bring him lettuce makes it sound like he really hasn't done the mitzvah yet, and he still needs to do it. And in that case, it must be possible to eat the lettuce and still not have done the mitzvah. Okay, so having established that it's a machloket and we're not going to solve the problem, we're moving on to the question of what kind of cooked food we should be putting on the Seder plate, and it sounds like eating. Okay, so Amar Rav Huna, Silka va'aruza. Rav Huna says it should be beets and rice. Rava hava mehadar silka va'aruza. Rava used to go specifically looking for beets and rice. Since it had come out of the mouth of Rav Huna. For the record, beets and rice does not sound like an especially expensive thing to be eating at a Yom Tov meal, and I kind of wonder about that, but I don't know exactly where to go with that thought. It just struck me. Amar Rav Ashe, Shma mina de Rav Huna late the Chayishla de Rabbi Yochanan ben Rav Ashi noticed something that you might also have noticed, which is that Rav Huna is planning, and Rava for that matter, is planning to eat rice at the Seder. And he says, I learned from this that Rav Huna is not worried about this thing that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri taught. Titania, because it says in the Braita, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri Omer, Orez min daganhu. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says rice is a variety of grain. Vechayavin al chimutzo karet, and you get karet for eating it when it's fermented, or possibly owning it when it's fermented. Ve'adam yotzei bo chavato b'Pesach, and a person can fulfill his obligation with it, presumably to eat matzah, on Pesach. So it seems that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri held that rice was like wheat and barley and spelt and rye and whatever shibolet shual is, which might be oats, that he just thought it was the sixth grain that can become chametz and you can make matzah out of it. And it sounds like Rav Huna and Rav think that that's not even worth worrying about. It's not only is it they don't agree with it, they're so certain it's not true, they're making it rice into their Seder food. Okay. Which is worth noting that a lot of the time when we teach about kitnio, we talk about this being a distinction between Ashkenazim and Sfardim, and that makes it sound medieval because the Sephardi and Ashkenazi communities are not really distinct until the early Middle Ages. But it sounds like there is, at least with rice specifically, there is a dispute about whether to eat rice on Pesach that goes back 1,000 years earlier, at least, and possibly more. Okay. Chizkiah Amar, afilu dag ubeitza shala. Chizkiah says even the fish and egg that's on it. Now, it seems like what he means by even is, we said you needed 2 cooked foods. It sounds like he's okay with 1 cooked food that has 2 ingredients. You dipped your fish in egg and then you fried it. That's 2 ingredients. I would argue maybe it's 3 ingredients because there's oil, but maybe that doesn't count. You're not really eating it, you're just using it to cook the other food. But Chizkiah seems to be okay with the fish and the batter being 2 foods. Rav Yosef Amar Tarich Shnei Minei Basar. Rav Yosef, on the other hand, wants 2 kinds of meat. Echad zecher lePesach ve'echad zecher leChagiga. One to commemorate the Pesach offering, and the other to commemorate the Chagiga offering. Right? Notice everybody here, except the very earliest of the Tanaim, everybody here is after the destruction of the temple. Almost none of them have ever actually offered a Korban Pesach. Rav Yosef is living a long time after the destruction, and so he's not eating sacrifices, but he says, like we should at least serve meat to remember that we're supposed to be eating sacrifices. Which everything at the Seder is organized, either we're doing this to remember that we are supposed to be doing it in Yerushalayim with sacrifices, or we're not doing this to remember that we should have been doing it, but we can't do it, right? And exactly which things you choose to avoid in order to remember that you're supposed to be doing them, and which things you choose to davka do in order to remember that you're doing them, it does not always agreed by everybody. Okay, and Ravina is our last position. He says, afilu grama ubishula. He agrees that you should have meat, but he does not think you need 2 pieces of meat. He thinks that the meat and the broth that you cooked it in count as 2 separate foods, and that's good enough. So it seems like we're not that attached to the number 2. Mostly we want there to be cooked food here. Rav Yosef seems particularly attached to the number 2. Everybody else is prepared to accept it as 2 foods if it even has 2 ingredients. Yes, Harvey, were you saying something?
The part that we're skipping talked about how you wanted to avoid even numbers.
Sorry, Harvey, I didn't hear what you said. Can you say that again? Harvey, did you say something about numbers? I couldn't hear what you were saying. I wonder if something is wrong with either my hearing or his microphone.
No, I don't hear him either. Something's wrong with
Can you
the,
hear me now?
Now I can hear you. Yes. What
Okay,
did you
yeah.
say?
Yeah, so the 2 is an even number. I thought you said the part we skipped was talking about being afraid of even numbers.
They're very afraid of even numbers, and I don't know why that doesn't come up here also. The reason it came up in the piece we skipped is because of the 4 cups of wine. And in particular, there seems to be an obsession with not drinking pairs of cups of things. But I would have thought this would be an issue also. I guess yeah, that's a good question. If you ask me, do I really believe that demons will attack you if you drink 2 cups of something instead of 1 or 3? I have to say that I'm kind of a Maimonidean person myself, and I don't really think demons exist. But there certainly do seem to be other people who do believe in them, so I have to acknowledge that. Mindy, you get a mazel tov.
yes, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Lovely.
It is something exciting these days.
Very nice. Okay, so that is the end of our Gemara. Do people have questions?
I lost my train of thought, but at some point I unmuted and wanted to ask you about the, oh God, I really lost it. Hold on. Shnei Tavshilin and, oh my God, sorry.
That's okay.
It seemed like at the end, it, oh, about mitzvot, srichot, kavanah. We just did mitzvot, srichot, kavanah, somebody who was saying it. And it seems just to go back to the Rav Yossi. Oh, I'm sorry. I should have interrupted you.
Okay, I'm sorry. Next
No,
time you should interrupt me.
That's okay. I have to read it over again and formulate my question again.
Okay. I want to welcome our new cheer person, Alana. Good to see you here.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
You're
The
very
class is
welcome.
great.
You're welcome. Okay. Are there other questions? And if not, let's talk about the next couple of weeks' schedule.
I just have a very general question, which is a very ignorant question. Is there any
no such thing.
correspondence in the order of the Gemara to the ordering of the Mishnah?
So, sort of. My husband used to say when he was teaching high school that the Gemara is organized around the Mishnah the way the dictionary is organized around the alphabet. It's not really about the Mishnah, but the Mishnah gives you a sort of a start jumping off point. It tells you where to put your bullet points. And the caveat to that, though, is that the placement of the individual paragraphs of Mishnah dispersed among the chunks of Gemara is relatively late and not 100% consistent, even after the advent of printing. And so it's entirely possible that the person deciding exactly what order to put this Gemara in was thinking about the entire chapter of Mishnah as a whole and not thinking about it as paragraphs. or even if they're thinking about it as paragraphs, they might not be the same ones we have. So I wasn't entirely fair before when I said that all the material about Kiddush that we had a couple of weeks ago really should be here, because in fact, it might be that instead the problem is that this piece of Mishnah should have been placed before that Gemara instead of here. And in fact, the problem is something done by a printer in the early modern period, not by the authors of the Gemara. But it's hard to know.
So the Gemara really isn't ordered around the Mishnah, even though the Mishnah comes first?
The Gemara is responding to the Mishnah,
Right.
but it's in a very sort of stream of consciousness kind of structure. So anything that you could think of as a result of saying something could be next.
Right, understood. And it uses it as a springboard, but like as soon as you have a piece of Mishnah, you'll see a Gemara that says, or what's the reason for this, or what does this mean? But then it goes off in tangents.
Yes, although in fairness, we need to be careful about the causality there. Other than the first piece of the Mishnah, the first piece of Gemara in a chapter, the reason why the Gemara responds to the Mishnah right away like that is because somebody chose to put that piece of Mishnah next to the Gemara, not the other way around. Or the very early printings of Gemara have the entire chapter of Mishnah printed, followed by the entire chapter of Gemara. And I believe there are manuscripts that are organized that way as well.
Oh.
Although there are very few manuscripts of Gemara in existence, the people who set about to burn them did a disturbingly good job.
I didn't know that.
Well, what I said is not 100% true. There are also versions that have it distributed, but they're not always distributed the same way. So somebody's still making a later editing choice about that.
Okay.
And I would argue that all of this material was meant to be learned by heart. Even once it was written down, it was meant to be thought of as a whole. You learn the whole thing, memorize the whole thing, and then think about it as a whole. And it's not really meant to be linear at all. What we're doing is the equivalent of trying to read the text on the computer screen by crawling across the computer screen, looking at one pixel at a time.
Right.
And we're not seeing the whole picture as a result.
So when you say it was intended to be learned as one, you mean in the early manuscripts way of it being organized?
Well, certainly the Mishnah seems to have been originally an oral document where you would know the entire thing by heart, which makes it much easier to make connections between different bits inside your head.
Right.
And it seems like the Talmud may also originally have been like that, but even once it's written down, is the scholarship of it is mostly being done by people who have limited access to books. There's still going to be a lot of memorizing being done. Remember that ink and parchment are tremendously expensive.
Right.
We are very, very blessed.
Yeah. And that we
More
could
on
find
that.
documents so easily. I found the evolution of the olive in 2 seconds.
Yeah, isn't that cool?
Yeah, I'll read it later.
Excellent.
There was a PBS two-parter recently on the history of writing that talks about the differences between writing on parchment and writing on papyrus. And,
That's cool.
Yeah, so it might be of interest.
I will search for that when we're done. It was on PBS, you said?
What's interesting is apparently papyrus came first in terms of what was popular in the West, and then after the fall of the Roman Empire, the business of distributing papyrus collapsed, and then people had to use parchment, which is much more expensive, and so that made books much harder to get after the fall of the Roman Empire.
Cool. I had no idea. I'll have to go look at that. Thank you. Okay. So in terms of the next week, we are going to meet. I hope people will come. It seems relevant for the week before Pesach. The 2 weeks after that, we will not be meeting. 2 weeks from tonight because it's Yom Tov, and 3 weeks from tonight because the days on which I would normally prepare are Yom Tov. But then hopefully we'll come back again the following Monday after Pesach.
Sure, that sounds
Okay.
great. Yep, thank you so much.
Okay. Wonderful. I will see all of you next Monday night.
Yes,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Deborah, thank you.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you.
Thank you. Good night.